even though this is my 5th reading, and last week I had a launch party in Billings, Elk River Books and Livingston feel like a home to this story. A few years ago, the Montana Quarterly published an essay version of this story that introduced Maurice Prairie Chief to readers across the state of Montana. And last year, when Maggie gave her reading, I made many new friends here, and so I'm very happy about that. And finally, Andrea and Elk River Books was the first bookstore to invite me to give a reading, even before my book was published. And I'm grateful for that. It made me feel like an author. It made me feel like my book was a real book for the first time. And I'm happy you guys are here tonight too, instead of at home listening to two forgetful old men on your TV. Wait a minute, I'm having a brain fart. Mandy, honey, why are we in Livingston tonight?
Your book reading.
Oh, okay. So instead, you're stuck with this old man tonight. I hope that you enjoy me more than the presidential debate people. So the story that is told in The Boy Who Promised Me Horses is told by a much younger man than you see before you. I was 23 in the fall of 1990 when I moved to Ashland, Montana to teach high school English at St. Leroy Indian School on the Northern Cheyenne Reservation. Maurice Prairie Chief was 9 years old. If you're new to this story and you find out tonight that Maurice passes away, don't be worried that you're finding out something that's going to ruin the ending of the story. Because I tell the readers that in the very first sentence of my book. Because my book was published by a university press, it had to go through a peer review process. And the first review came back with a strong recommendation to change the order of my book, to move his death to the end of the book. And I was devastated. I didn't know if I had the energy to rewrite the entire book. So I talked to my acquisitions editor, Clark Whitehorn, and he was opposed to it. He said, no way. And I was relieved. He said, if you move the death to the end, then it becomes just another story about a tragic death. You think after 4 readings I'd have this part of it out. Instead, it's about a remarkable life. I've enjoyed many personal responses from people who read this book. I want to share a few with you right now. The first is from Dr. Russ Alexander, the man who hired me to teach at St. Leroy in 1990. And I believe he's listening right now, so Russ, I apologize if I embarrass you. He wrote me an email and he said, I was surprised by how good your book was. I think that's a compliment, though. He went on to say, I thought the most important theme was what happened to Marie's fate. But what struck me is that it is first and foremost a story of a very special friendship. The setting on the reservation is really secondary. The Boy Who Promised Me Horses is a story about a remarkable life and a very special friendship. Dr. David Craig, who was a professor at MSU Billings, he now lives in Bozeman. He read a draft of my book before there was even a publisher in sight, which I really appreciate. Many of my friends who said they were interested in reading my book or my manuscript would either their eyes would glaze over after a while, or they would read a chapter or two and say, well, I thought I had time, but I didn't. But Dave Craig read it all, and he describes himself as a structuralist. And he sent me this message, and he said he was most impressed, or was impressed, by my ambitious tri-part purposes. Which surprised me because I didn't have any purposes in mind when I wrote the book. At one point I tried to have a purpose, and it just got in the way, so I wrote it. But he said, 3 purposes: living in a culture not of your own, coming-of-age story, and elegy for Maurice. And he said his favorite part of the elegy for Maurice was my ability to evoke the spirit of play and adventure. And he went on to say, I'll call it the Maurice effect. So that's the title of today's presentation, the Maurice effect. So I asked myself, what is the Maurice effect? And I went back and looked at all the passages where Maurice and I go on an adventure. And one of the things I discovered is there's a physical and imaginary leaving. We leave the reservation, we leave the school, we leave the classroom, we leave it behind. In nature writing, there's a term called sense of place. And hockey players, even though we're dumb and get hit in the head a lot, we have a term, we call it creating time and space. So I took those 2 phrases, modified and combined them to coin the phrase time and place. Maurice and I created our own time and place for each other through our spirit of play and adventure. And that is what the Maurice effect is. So I want to read a passage to you that illustrates the Maurice effect. And this passage in the book takes place towards the end in the chapter Time and Distance. And that chapter, I'm driving across the Bighorn Mountains. It's the only time I've driven across the mountains alone. And I'm driving to pick up Maurice in Riverton, Wyoming, because he said his sister's boyfriend is beating him up every day. But the memory that I write about took place in the fall of 1992. Maurice was 11 years old, and we just went up to the Bighorn Mountains to do some exploring. Shortly after passing by the fallen city, and under Steamboat Rock, with most of the elevation gained on the way to the plateau, I pulled into a gravel turnout, and Maurice and I surveyed the land before us, vibrant meadows stretching for miles that were surrounded by shaggy pine. But what piqued Maurice's interest were the dark mounds of rock that emerged above the trees, like tropical volcanoes through a mist of clouds. Maurice pointed with his lips at the formation in the middle. It had the sheerest cliff face. I grabbed the backpack, and we were off. On top, we sat and passed a water bottle and bag of M&Ms back and forth, staring at the pristine land before us. Maurice gave me the last 5 M&Ms and handed back the water bottle, and without a word stood and started walking down the back side. Halfway down, we entered the trees, and the view we had seen minutes before was lost. He took a right at the bottom and started moving in the direction of the next formation we had chosen to climb. I looked to get my bearings. All I saw were trees. We started losing elevation more than I'd anticipated, although from where we had just sat on our vantage point, we only saw a rolling canopy of trees, without many clues to indicate what lay below. I knew at some point we would need to gain our elevation back, but I didn't mention this to Maurice. I trusted our endurance, savored the moment of traveling rugged country with someone I didn't have to worry about keeping up or complaining about being hungry, not having enough water, being cold, whatever. And I had faith in Maurice, which sounds contradictory to what I've stated before. But I had learned that although he didn't always get his facts straight or find what he's looking for, he never got us so far lost that we couldn't get back to where we started. At the bottom of the ravine that had narrowed as we descended, we came upon a gurgling creek just 3 feet across, which we easily hopped. Maurice turned right and started following the direction from which it fell. And we began to recover in chunks the elevation we had lost, striding up boulders strewn across the creek. Suddenly, Maurice stopped. And I assumed he was catching his breath, although I don't ever remember him needing to rest. He stood, staring at the water. Mark said having a glass of wine might affect me, but it just made me cry more, I guess. Then he walked over and scrambled onto a giant boulder that had plugged a narrow gash between the solid rock of the waterway. Behind the rock, water had slackened to a tranquil pool. So still, the movement of the clear water was imperceptible. The only evidence of escape appearing in the form of twin horsetail waterfalls that spilled several feet to a smaller pool below. He lay down on his stomach and hung his head over the placid water. I sat down on a rock to watch. "I'm looking for fish," he said softly, not taking his eyes from the water. "See any?" "Nope." But he stayed where he was, cupping his hands to the side of his face to cut the glare from the mirror-like surface. He wore a windbreaker that must have been pulled out of the St. Mabray clothing room. The mostly black jacket was decorated with orange and green neon geometric shapes and a wide pink stripe going from sleeve to collar, typical late 80s fashion. He used the tips of his toes to keep from sliding off, and I marveled how he clung to the rocks in his cheap, off-brand tennis shoes, several sizes too big. "Yep, there's one," he whispered. "It's got white tips to its fins," he added a minute later. I guessed he had spotted a little brook trout. How did it get here, I wondered. He inched backward like a caterpillar and pushed himself onto one elbow and began to search the rock below his chin. Then I saw him use his fingertips like a tweezers. "Ant," he said, without raising his voice or turning his head. He reached his hand over the water and rubbed his index finger and thumb together and resumed his position. I watched his face, which he held motionless instead of looking at the water. Then a grin broke from the corner of his mouth and rippled to his ear. "Dave, did you see that?" he whispered. "Yes," I said, "I did." "Hey Dave, I'm feeding fish. They're crazy about ants." Perched on top of the huge rock, he appeared tiny, yet with his colorful jacket absorbing the warm sunlight and the youthful smile that beamed from his face, he glowed, easily the most vibrant and alive object on the mountain. So that's an illustration of the Maurice effect. And when I wrote those passages, I didn't know about the Maurice effect yet. But it, subconsciously, I must have, felt it in the imagery of us, going on an adventure and then disappearing into the trees and going into, territory that we believe nobody had ever explored before. At the beginning of my book, I have an epigraph from the poet Rilke. "Each blind lurch of the world leaves its disinherited, to whom no longer the past and not yet the future belong." When I arrived in Ashland in 1990, it did take me long to realize that Maurice was on the margin of an already marginalized community. The Maurice effect, the spirit of our plain adventure, allowed us to connect in a different time and place. This connection balanced the blind lurch that Rilke writes about, created moments where Maurice and I belonged together. The first chapter, I said, tells the reader that Maurice died in the very first sentence. The first chapter also sets up the structure of the book, kind of an outline to the reader. And it tells the reader that I spent 4 years living in Ashland, and I went to Missoula for a year for grad school, and I returned to Ashland for 4 years. When I left to go to Missoula, I never expected to return to Ashland. I never expected to see Maurice again. that spring, I had a job offer in Stevensville, south of Missoula, and I had an interview in Eureka, Montana. But I wasn't for sure what I was going to do next. And before making my decision, I thought of a conversation I had with a friend of mine named Elaine Middleburg. The year I was in Missoula, hung around with Elaine Middleburg more than anybody else. She was my best friend in Missoula. And one Christmas, I told her I was driving through Ashland on my way to Minnesota to go home. I wanted to buy a present for Maurice. She's like, I know Maurice. She said, when she worked as a teacher's aide in the elementary, the teacher would send Maurice to her when he went to his work, and he said, I would do my work if my best friend were here. She said, who's your best friend? He said, Dave. So I decided I'd go back to Ashland knowing this information. I figured I could try harder with helping Maurice. But nothing went as planned when I got back. For one, I was engaged, met a woman in Missoula, I was engaged, and St. Maurice said we couldn't live together in housing, so we ended up getting married that summer. So Maurice avoided my wife, didn't seem to like her, wasn't anything that she did. And then, before the school year even started, he mysteriously disappeared and moved to Riverton, Wyoming. I found out later he went there to live with his sister and her boyfriend's family. Over Labor Day weekend, he called me and said, my sister's boyfriend beats me up every day, will you come get me? So I went and picked him up, brought him back. He started school that year, his eighth grade year. And even then, this vision I had of coming back to Ashland and us evolving into this family didn't come to fruition. I thought we'd go to sweats together, and Maurice would come over for dinner every night, and he'd come over for weekends, and we'd go on camping trips. None of that happened. And so I had one goal still that I thought I could help him with, which was helping him with his schoolwork. So I went to visit with his teachers in the middle school. And what I heard was pretty disturbing in terms of the work he was doing, how much he was struggling. I talked to the middle school principal, and he came up with a solution to have Maurice placed into the St. Labret group home. And St. Labret had 5 group homes at this time that housed different ages of boys and girls. And these young people came from all over the 5-state region. Many of them were court ordered to be there. They were in trouble with the law. Or they were foster care kids who couldn't find a placement. And as teachers, they were very challenging, difficult students. And there was a stigma to being in the group home, to being called a group home kid. But I didn't know of any other solution for Maurice. His grandma was getting old. It didn't seem like a safe place for him to live. He wasn't doing his schoolwork. He wasn't coming to school all the time. And so I agreed it was the best option. The principal said to me, Dave, bring Maurice to a meeting with the group home staff on Wednesday. So I brought Maurice there. And my assumption was that the meeting would be for the people there to show Maurice how much they cared about him and to assure him that things were going to be okay. But the entire meeting was just the director of the group home going on and on about all the rules they had. And if he didn't follow the rules, he wouldn't earn any privileges. And Maurice was terrified. I could tell he was terrified. That Friday afternoon, Maurice was walking through the village, and I yelled to him, hey Maurice, you want to do something this weekend? I knew it would be our last chance to do anything because he probably wouldn't have privileges for months to even leave the group home. And he agreed to do something with me. And so we made a plan to go out into the forest and shoot clay pigeons with my shotgun. I've been letting Maurice shoot my shotgun at clay pigeons and turkeys for years. So So this scene begins with the Maurice effect. There is a moment where we kind of disappear, and we have a fun adventure, and then we have a pretty intense confrontation, which I don't think we would have survived without the Maurice effect and the connection we have. Okay, so this is fall of 1995, and Maurice is 14 years old. I pulled off the highway at Camps Pass, the eastern end of the Custer Forest, the spot where we had gotten my first Christmas tree so many years before, and we changed places. I let Maurice drive my truck too. Where the truck entered the forest, ponderosa pine covered the hills, blocking out the sun, creating a dark tunnel through the woods, the occasional semi passing down US Highway 212, becoming a muffled whoosh, and then disappearing altogether. Maurice drove on for miles, picking the truck through winding turns, clinging to inside banks where the narrow road plunged into steep ravines. The whole time, gradually losing elevation, trees thinning to reveal spectacular vistas in every direction. I told him to pull off into a large meadow where I'd once hunted sharp-tailed grouse, and pointed with my lips to the top of a small hill. Below it, on the opposite side, was a sandstone ledge that dropped 10 feet beneath it. If we stood on the ledge to shoot, it would give us more time for the clay pigeons to float before they hit the ground. We can use more time, I thought. We sat in the truck and opened the cookies and a couple Mountain Dews. I'm a little hungry, thirsty, I didn't have dinner. Are you ready to shoot? I asked him. Yeah, ready to outshoot you again. Hey, saving that for later? I pointed with my lips at the cookie crumbs on his face. He smiled and stuffed a whole cookie into his mouth and chomped loudly, crumbs tumbling out. Several yellow jackets sensed our food and were hovering near the tops of our partly open windows. You better watch it. Those yellow jackets will eat those crumbs right off your lip. I think he said, won't bother me. But with his mouthful of cookie, I couldn't tell. He gulped some Mountain Dew, got the cookie down, and said, bring him on, Dad. I chugged the rest of my Dew. A gulp so large it swelled my cheeks, and felt a sharp object stab the back of my throat. An explosion of Mountain Dew erupted from my pursed lips and sprayed the dashboard. Hasselhoff? Maurice yelled. There was a yellow jacket in the can. I drank it. It was in my mouth. Maurice swiveled his head like an owl, first at the dashboard, then at me, then at the dashboard. And he laughed, and he couldn't stop. I rarely heard him laugh this uncontrollably, like he was watching Chubby Chetty slapping his belly all over again. It's not funny, I said over his laughter. You could have stung me in the mouth, halfway down my throat. You could be crawling around in my stomach right now, stinging me. He gained control of his laughter and composed himself. Then he said, feigning seriousness, or in your shorts. His giggling then surpassed anything I'd heard from him. He was giving Sean Backbone and Alan Fisher a run for their money. A tiny revved-up version of Elaine Wilbur rolled around in the seat of my truck. Dave, he said, calming down a little and sitting up, look. And he pointed at the dashboard with his lips. That ain't no yellow jacket. Perched on top of the dashboard, amid the thick spray of sticky pop, was a chocolate chunk wedged into a jagged piece of cookie. I didn't know if he'd ever stop laughing. I started laughing too. The cab of the truck overflowed with laughter and yellow jackets. which teemed through the slits in the windows like water sliding over a dam. We bailed out of the truck, Maurice falling to the ground, mumbling, "Man, my stomach hurts, Dave. My stomach hurts." I'll take a little pause to explain a few things. You've probably figured out by now that the Indians around Ashland pointed with their lips. And it's a real subtle gesture, which I can't do since I have grown my mustache. I don't know why. So that's my excuse for not demonstrating it to you. And then your shorts was a comeback used on the reservation in the 90s, and Maurice was an expert at it, and he got me every single time. And the one expression that I used, Maurice said "hasabov," and it's a colloquial term that Cheyenne use, and to translate it into English would be like "holy cow" or "wow." And a student that I mentor who just earned her master's degree in linguistics in Cheyenne language said the complete translation would be, in a literal sense, "Why did you cause that to happen?" But in Cheyenne culture, when people say it, it makes everything funnier. So if you've ever seen Native people laughing, and then somebody says something and they laugh even more, if they're Cheyenne people, one of them probably said "us" above, which caused the laughter. When I got to this part at another reading, the air conditioner came on and was so loud. And this part, we went from a loud passage and this transitions into a softer part, so I think the train's gone. We shot through most of the clays, using up 2 boxes of shells. My shoulder ached and my ears rang as we sat and dangled our legs over the ledge. One by one, soft sounds replaced the vacuum as the echoing diminished. Meadowlarks calling to each other in sing-song patterns, patient wind scurrying through tall grass. I felt an ant crawl over my left hand, which was pressed palm down to the cool stone. Clouds, that moments before were just a hazy background to zinging black and yellow discs, resumed their shapes in lazy drift across the sky. I looked down and saw that 2 ants were now crawling above my knuckles, rising up and down as they crossed my raised veins. I let them be. Maurice's hand was inches from mine. It was a place his skin had darkened the most over the summer. I sensed him going somewhere. I sensed him I wanted to grab his hand to keep him with me. We sat in silence, strangely then, the only 2 objects on the landscape that did not move or make noise. We walked slowly back to the truck, not even bothering to recap the pop explosion or shooting adventure with an us guys story. "What do you want to do next?" I asked, after miles of no sound but the hum of gravel and Maurice still behind the wheel. We were on 10 Mile Creek Road heading back to the highway. This was his last day of freedom. I wanted to make sure he had fun, but I also thought he might want to get home to pack to say see ya to Grandma and Kendra. "It don't matter," he said, then added wistfully, "Man, Dave, I wouldn't mind getting lost today. There ain't going to be a next time." We switched drivers when we found our way back to the highway. As I drove the pavement to Ashland, I went through a list of questions. None came out right when I heard it in my head. At Grandma's house, he slipped off the seat without a word, letting the door fall back so gently it didn't shut, and began moving to the house, creeping toward the door like a shadow. I got out and said over the top of the doorframe, "Hey, Maurice, I'll come visit you tomorrow." He didn't turn. "Maurice, I said loudly, "It's going to work out. It's going to be okay." He stopped. I expected him to pause and then keep going, but he turned. "No, it's not," he said, his voice flat. "It's not going to be okay." I stepped away from my door and walked toward him. "I don't want to go. I don't want to live in the homes." We stood face to face. "Dave, can you make it so I don't have to?" "It's all set in place," Marie said. I can't stop it now." "Can you take me back to Wyoming then? We could leave tonight." "You can't go back to Wyoming, Maurice. You weren't going to school. They were making you do all the work." I paused. "Your sister's boyfriend was beat. Still better than living in the homes. Anything's better than that." I thought about explaining that some things weren't, but did I know? "Maurice, I can't take you back to Wyoming." I wasn't prepared for his reaction. "You don't want to help me then, do you, Dave?" he screamed. I'd never heard this voice from him before, a pathos so deep it tore into me. Tears welled in his eyes. A giant drop fell and streaked through the dust on his right cheek. He swiped at it. "You don't want to help me, do you?" Then he spun and ran into his house and slammed the door. So one thing that you'll learn in the book, if you read it, is that we lived in a place called the Village. And teachers lived there, some students from the school, travel members. And the home that Maurice was going to move in was only 3 or 4 houses from where I lived, and not too far from where his house was. Although for Maurice, I'm sure it seemed like a long way away since he would not be able to leave the house. So on Sunday night, I had a plan to walk over to see him in the group home. He was supposed to be placed in the group home on Sunday afternoon. On Sunday night, I walked over to the Sunrise group home. The house mom opened the door partway and asked, "Yes?" It appeared she didn't recognize me. "Do you think I could visit Maurice? I know it's probably against the rules, to have visitors on the first day, but Maurice?" She interrupted, looking more puzzled. "Oh yeah, Maurice. No, he's not here." "Will he be back soon?" She frowned again. "No, he won't be back at all. He's not here." "What do you mean he's not here?" "He never checked in." "What does that mean?" "He never checked in," she repeated. "I heard you the first time. I still don't understand. Didn't you go to his house to get him?" "No, we didn't. When it's a volunteer placement, they come to us." "So, he was supposed to come over here on his own by himself?" "Yes, he was supposed to come over here on his own by himself." God, I wanted to knock the sarcasm off her face, and I wanted to yell at her. I rehearsed it in my mind. Couldn't you tell he didn't want to go? Couldn't you see he was afraid? Don't you know what the fuck you're doing? Instead, I asked, "Can he still come over tonight or tomorrow?" An annoyed look replaced her frown, but she kept her composure. "I'm not sure how it works when a youth misses a volunteer check-in. I'll have to ask the director." I turned off the steps without saying goodbye. Coming back to Ashland was starting to feel like a mistake. The type you made, even after convincing yourself you were doing the right thing. Realizing too late that the harder you tried, the more that would likely be lost in the end. I wished I had stayed in Missoula and taught at Stevensville. Or if I was granting myself wishes, I wish I'd stayed in science at St. John's and become a physical therapist like I really wanted to, where I could witness each exercise I prescribed, move the person one step closer to being healed. Results as a teacher were ambiguous at best. And the reason I'd ranked highest for wanting to be a physical therapist in the first place was to help people who were only temporarily injured. Maybe Maurice's wounds were already permanent. That morning, as I cupped my hands around my coffee, I felt things were going to be saved. The sensation feeling like a weight lifted. Now the burden was back, heavier than ever. The only consolation being that I had something new to blame, the group home. The colossal ineptness of the director, the insipid indifference of the house mom. I added them to my list. His non-existent father, his almost absent mother, a God too cold-hearted to abolish fetal alcohol syndrome, the whole damn circumstance of the reservation that left so many in poverty, the dangerous Jimmy Chapman, his cousins, of course, the shiftless Willie and the shady Reno, the teachers, too, at St. Labre's school, who weren't skilled enough to teach him to read, and my Indian friends, some of the kindest and most generous people I met in my entire life, who seemed to ignore him, watched him walk down the streets of the village alone, never invited him to sweat, never offered to teach him to drum at a powwow. If I'd lost the sense that things were going to work out, I needed this list. The cost felt too high if I didn't. Without it, I had only myself to blame. I wasn't sure I could face the guilt of falling short at one more thing. My lack of progress during my 5th year was proof I wasn't born to be a teacher. And as I entered the front door, my wife barely looked up from her magazine. I pondered if I were failing her, like I was failing Maurice. If I could ever give her what she needed. I didn't move beyond the entryway. Thought she noticed a look on my face, say something. She looked down. I wanted to tell her what happened. I almost began. Then the page flipped, and she continued reading. I went and sat on the front steps. Maybe I expected too much from her. Maybe we all expect too much from those we attempt to love. Wanting them to remove the doubt and confusion, needing them to ease the panic of that moment that seems just out of reach for us to bear when real love arrives. I only knew that the risk with Maurice seemed easier at first and safer than other things I had failed at in life. It wasn't complicated like teaching. I could do what I was good at. It meant games to play in the woods, hike and climb for hours, enjoy cookies on the bank of a pond. And who would notice if I failed? No one else was lining up to do it. His grandma loved him, I knew that. And anyone who said his mom didn't love him enough to take care of him, I would call ignorant. But for various reasons, perhaps some of their own doing, his grandma and mom were unable to care for him as he needed, as he deserved. If no one even noticed, there was no risk to me, no way to judge myself. There could be no failure, no heartbreak. Now, I wasn't so sure. That's how the chapter ends. Maurice never did move into the group home. Shortly after that, he came to my house in the morning on a school day, which is the first time he'd ever woken me up on a school day in the morning to tell me his grandma had passed away. And for a moment I thought he would now be a ward of the state and we could have him court ordered to be placed in the group home, but it turned out that his mom hadn't given up custody. And so we didn't even try to read, I'm sorry, Mountain Dew's making me burp. We didn't try to go through the process of him getting placed in the home. It's interesting, though, this story, I write a lot about how two people, Maurice and I, were unable to communicate very well, but when I read that passage, it was a pretty intense, engaged passage, for us anyway, at that point. I shared the essay version with a mentor of mine, Father Don Talfas. I had him for freshman year English at St. John's University in 1985, and we've been friends ever since. And he's an amazing guy. He's in his 90s, and he still reads my work. And I shared the essay with him, and he wrote back to me, and he said, "It expresses what is often true of love, the inequality of love, at least seen by one of the parties. One party may be agonizing over how the other party feels. But love is a mystery which attracts almost any human being. Genuine love will break your heart. We have to be satisfied by that. There is no cure." The Boy Who Promised Me Horses is a story about a remarkable life and a special friendship, and perhaps it is also a story about love. The Maurice effect allowed me to get to that moment. Heartbreak and genuine love were both a possibility. Rilke writes, "For one human being to love another, that is perhaps the most difficult of all our tasks." The Maurice effect can make this task easier. For all of you, you can create personal meaning for the Maurice effect. But I ask you, how can you create time and place to connect with the people you're attempting to love? How can you open yourself to those moments when heartbreak or genuine love arrives, and likely both? Thank you. So, yeah, I was. A couple things didn't go as planned. I thought I'd be able to eat a cookie, and I realized, no, that wasn't going to happen. The Mountain Dew made me burp, and then the wine made me a little emotional too. So, but anyway, thank you for your patience. Any questions? Yes.
When I read the book, I was struck immediately by your courage in announcing right away that Maurice had passed.
Mm-hmm.
And to me, it made Maurice and the book more vibrant. It made every minute Maurice had on this earth more meaningful, because I knew he was gone.
Mm-hmm.
What was your reasoning for letting people know right away?
Well, I think to be honest with the reader in how the book came about, I had to keep that structure and that order, because in the book I explain how I Googled the story of his death, because in Montana all I heard was he was hit by a train, and I heard nothing else. And so one day I Googled Maurice Prairie Chief death, Missouri train, and didn't expect to find anything. And back when he passed away, I don't think Google existed, or we weren't using it like we do every day. And so I read the article, and I wrote that chapter. And then I wrote chapter 2. And about that time, I was reconnecting with a friend of mine from elementary school. And we hadn't talked since 8th grade. He went to a different high school and college. And in 2nd grade, we'd have conversations on the way home from school, like which Charlie's Angels was the prettiest. And I guess when you have those type of conversations in 2nd grade, you're bonded for life. And so I told him I was writing a book, and I felt pretty safe because I was writing a book. So he said, "Well, send it to me." So I sent him the first 2 chapters, and then he said, "Well, they're great, send me chapter 3. And I'm like, "I haven't written it yet." So then for a 3-year process, I would write a chapter and then send it to him. And that's how the whole book was written. So I wanted to stay true with the process, because I wanted to take the reader along on the same journey that I took. And so that was one of the reasons why I started with his death. And once I started on that path, and especially when that one reviewer said move his death towards the end, I had no idea how I really would have done that. And it would have been something like starting from the first day that I met him, and then just kind of telling the story in chronological order. But I really liked how those first 2 chapters got a lot of backstory out of the way, and told the reader quite a few things so that I didn't have to always retell that or remind the reader later. And so once it worked in that way, I really felt like there was no other option. And then, of course, when my acquisitions editor made that comment to me, then I really believed it. Like, this book, like you said, it was a celebration of his life, and there's hope in it.
I'm glad you did.
Oh, thank you. All right, any other questions? Yes?
Could you give us a background of the cover photo that you used?
Oh, yeah.
And did you have to really push to have this particular photo? What was your input?
Oh, with the publisher, you mean?
Right.
Oh, no. Let me show you this is the whole picture. And my friend John Warner took this, and he was a photographer at St. Bray, and he was a good friend of mine, so he always had his camera. And so this is the horse Dudley that Maurice brought to my house to ride. And the publisher sent me a questionnaire on creating the cover. And they told me they would have final say in all the artistic decisions. But I told them I wanted a warm cover. I told them some of the colors I liked. But then I sent this picture in. And at first, they cropped it like this. And my first thought was, why am I not on the cover?
You actually sent me a message and you were quite disappointed.
Yeah.
You were disappointed.
Yeah. And I'm like, look at those great pants. I mean, there's like 6 pleats on each side. But then the more I looked at this cover, the more I kind of fell in love with it. And I realized, if you look at this, your eyes kind of wander and kind of go all over, and you look over here, you look over here, and I think that your eyes kind of just go right to his face, and it's just the calm, peaceful look on his face. And that was a place that Maurice felt he belonged on the horse. And I think it just worked perfectly. And after maybe a half a day of thinking, maybe that the picture should be bigger and show everything, then I instantly fell in love with it. And it wasn't until maybe a week or 2 before the final PDF file was completed that they sent me the entire cover. And so the entire cover has me kind of faded out on the back. So, and that's a 1990 birthday shirt. And I have one just like it still. So I wore it to my last reading, but it smelled like mothballs and a little tight. So, any other questions or comments? Yes.
You mentioned in your reading fetal alcohol syndrome.
Yes.
Is that what Maurice had?
I don't know for sure.
Okay.
I mean, I suspect that he did, but I don't know for sure. And there were some details I left out about his family, and some of his other siblings, younger siblings, had some severe issues, and so I left that out. And they obviously were, on the spectrum enough where they couldn't be in a normal house. They had to be in, a foster care system with kind of supervised caretakers. I'm just suspecting that he did. In the book, I talk about taking Maurice to a psychological test that they did to kind of determine why he couldn't read or do math very well. And I don't remember hearing the official results. The principal basically said, he's never going to be able to read. He's never going to be able to get past a certain point in math. But I'm not sure what the official, diagnosis was. In that moment, I was kind of on a rant, and there are many people, many kids on the reservation that do suffer from, fetal alcohol syndrome or some degree of, drug or alcohol abuse.
Is that, you mentioned that they didn't invite him to go to sweats or to drink.
Yeah.
That seemed a little strange to me, that he
Yeah.
was sort of even on the outside of the tribe of the rest of the.
Yeah. Yeah, it is upsetting, and I like to think in that rant I was an equal opportunity offender. Offended God, criticized myself, criticized the teachers, criticized the natives in the community, and it was just the reality. I mean, he didn't have a father. His grandpa wasn't involved in his life. He didn't have that connection to a extended family that was involved in those things. And the men in the community in the village who did do those things, they would invite their friends' kids over, but and they didn't invite Maurice. And there were a few times when I asked Maurice if he wanted to come along with me, which I didn't know if it was my place to do, and he just never accepted. There's one scene where it's when I returned back to Ashland after being in Missoula, and I was putting up a sweat, kind of in, a Thanksgiving sweat for earning my master's degree and coming back, and being married, and just kind of a sweat to say thank you. And I asked Maurice to help me get rocks for the sweat, and he helped me do that. And then he said he was going to help me, get the sweat ready, but then he never showed up that day. When I went to pick him up, he wasn't there. So, yeah, it is. I think I capture a lot of the beauty and good things on the reservation communities, but in this case, this was something that was unfortunate that Maurice wasn't embraced or picked up by some of the other adult men in the community. Any other questions or comments? Yes, maybe? Sorry.
I don't have a question.
Oh.
I've been crying about this book since I saw the excerpt in Montana Quarterly, and you did it again. I'm back here just hanging out of tears. It's just wonderful, and you're a wonderful storyteller, and I wanted to say thank you.
Oh, thank you, Maggie. It means a lot. I think you have a question?
I think that the dialogue is fantastic. I don't know how you were able to do that. You can hear him and see him and the comments, and just really amazing the way you did that.
Oh. Did you have a question or just the...
No, I just comment.
Oh, thank you. I really appreciate that. And it's interesting because when I finished the book, and I said, well, okay, now I have to find an agent and get this published. So I read a bunch of essays and books on how to get, how to find an agent, write a query letter. So I actually sent a query letter to the person who wrote the book on how to do it. And this person sent me an email back and said, I'm fascinated, send me some more. I'm like, okay, this is easy. This is going to be hard. Well, no, she rejected it. At that point, it was 177,000 words. So the version it's in now is about 110, so I cut out quite a bit. Then I went through some long dry spells before I, had another, like somebody just showing a little bit of interest. Another person, it was a woman agent. Interestingly enough, most of the agents were women that I wrote to. And she wanted more pages, and then she said, I couldn't connect with your voice. And it was important, but I couldn't connect to it. So she passed on it. And then I had someone say, let me give you some advice. Read your dialogue out loud to yourself so you can improve it. And so I felt at one point, either these agents were just trying to be mean to me, or just working on it so many times over, I improved the dialogue to a point where you said it, you could hear him. And I've also had people tell me too that they felt like they could connect to me as the narrator too, so perhaps I improved my voice as well.
I think that the dialogue that you wrote in Maurice's words, it seemed very, very realistic to me, and that, the short bursts of words, there weren't big long sentences, just enough to get the thought across. And I felt like I could hear him doing it. So That's why I'm not an agent.
I wish you were. Yes.
I know we kind of stumbled in here in the back here, but that at the moment you're talking about with your wife and you're walking in and she's reading that magazine and I like it, that made me feel emotional in that way of thinking of all those times with your partner that you're wanting, you know, something to be said without saying anything, and it, like that one small moment of her turning the page of like so much wanting there. There's so much emotion there without it being said, and I think I'm also a couples therapist, so I know that feeling of wanting, you know, for people who just need something and they don't know how to say it maybe.
Right.
And I think that's really impactful. So.
Yeah, I think a lot of relationships suffer from, you know, we hope that the other person can read our mind and give us what we need when we need it, but it doesn't always work that way.
Yeah, that idea of being seen.
Unless you find a new wife. Yes.
Are you familiar with IEFA in the universities, Indian Education for All?
You know, not very much so, because I haven't taught at a public school.
Okay.
So I just know I've seen some of the material, like at MSU Billings, I've seen some of the packets they put together for teaching novels and things like that. Yes.
My thought was when I first read this book after crying for about an hour, then I laid it down and I thought, this should be part of the IEFA program so that instructors in Montana can read what it's like to connect with children like Marie's.
Yeah.
Because they do, and they don't know what to do.
Yeah. I mean, I would like to see it be taught in schools, you know, high schools in Montana, but I wouldn't want it to be considered under the Indian Education for All Act, because I'm not a native writer, and I wouldn't consider this Native American literature. I would never want this to take place of a novel written by, you know, a native writer from Montana. So maybe you know, they could teach it, you know, in the sociology class or the English class. But I would say, you know, teach a novel by James Welch or Deborah Erling.
Oh, absolutely. But I think in educators in general need to read it as part of their...
Yeah. You don't think that there are some scenes in there that would make it inappropriate for high school kids?
No.
Okay, good.
No. In college kids, yes. This would be at the college level.
Oh.
College.
She was a professor.
What about high school, though? High school kids could read this?
Oh, yes.
Okay.
Oh, yeah. No question.
Okay.
Heavens, yes.
I wanted to follow up with something that Maggie said. Oh, you have a question?
I have a question.
I thought you were telling me to speak louder.
Oh no, I actually have a question from a live streamer.
No way.
Well, yes, of course I do.
Is it your mom?
Yes. Just give her a little wave.
Hi,
Roxy. She knows, you know, a little bit more of the story, but so she is kind of revealing that Maurice did have a child.
Okay.
And so she wanted to know if you had met his child or have any relationship.
How did she find that out?
Well, she knows things.
Okay. I would like to have a relationship with him, and I have reached out to him and to his mother, and I found out his name and his mother's address from Maurice's sister Kathy, who's a character in the book. And Kathy recently told me she had 0 pictures of Maurice, so I took negatives and made about 30 pictures and gave them to Kathy. And then I wrote to Maurice's son and said, you know, I'm a friend of your dad. I have some pictures I would like to send you, and if you want to ask me anything else, but I haven't heard anything back. And so, and I did reach out to him probably 3 or 4 years ago, before the book was even published. And I didn't hear back from him either at that point. So.
And he never met Maurice?
No, he never met Maurice. I think he would have been, his mom, he would have been, how do you say this? She was pregnant with him when Maurice passed away.
She hasn't said thank you yet, but I'm expecting
Okay.
it.
That is, tell her that that was a very challenging question. And that next time to serve me up a softball. Something I can really swing at. Not,
You did okay. It sounds like you made the offer. I think that's.
but Nikki talked about the dialogue and hearing Maurice's voice, and one of the strategies I used was to describe the landscape in more detail. And the more detail I could describe the landscape, the more memories that would come back. And then the more memories that would come back, the stronger emotions I felt, and then I could start to hear his voice.
I told somebody when I read this book, I said, I could smell the sage, I could taste the dust.
Yeah. There's that scene where I'm in Ashland, it's probably 4 years after he passed away, and I'm in the little cafe and I see a painting that his Uncle Doug had painted, which I bought, and I have 2 original Uncle Doug paintings. And then I decided to go back to Stag Rock to visit a place that we had been before. And I described a scene where I'm driving to a place where my truck had been parked, and then all the smells and sounds bring me back to where I can almost, it's like it opened up a portal to my past and I could see us standing there. And then that's where I could hear his voice.
So maybe one more question, or should we make Dave sign books?
You can sign books.
Thank you.
Where's the deal?
Thank you.